I just wanted to come at you guys with a praise report, especially since I am now learning Hebrew from a fellow Orthodox Jew friend of mine, and he has been so gracious and kind. I am starting to be able to read some of the basic liturgy in that textbook without any accent problems, because it's a third language that could easily happen. And then, secondly, not only did I have a 2 hour conversation with him about the scriptures, I had another conversation over coffee with a former dispensationalist who is looking for truth. And to both of them, of course, I tried to present the Nazarene position without some crazy conversion lines. I just tried to converse with them. Both very receptive and open, and also grateful that I don't tell them they're going to go to hell for not believing this thing and that thing, because that's something that occurs very often. One thing I tried to explain to both of them is that both in the rabbinic and Protestant world, there's a lot of abrogation and interpolation, and that's what makes our path the narrow path. For example, in Protestant Christianity, I've constantly heard people call the Myers-Briggs personality test demonic. The issue with that is it's just a tool. There's nothing in scripture that actually condemns it. And just like Christians try to make substitutions and add a tradition into the word that isn't there, instead of just going back to Elohim's words, the Jewish tradition does it too, because according to the sages in Genesis, the person who Jacob wrestled against was not some regular heavenly angel. It wasn't Elohim. It was rather the guardian angel of Esav or Esau. And this is not something you get from reading the text directly, and people just mindlessly follow this. The Protestant Christian that I had a conversation with today brought up to me Galatians chapter 4 and verse 9, where it says, "But now that you know Elohim, or rather are known by Elohim, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years." He wants to use this to say that the feast days are somehow done away with. But when Paul says that people turn from Elohim and are observing special days, months, and years, he's saying they're doing everything contrary to the seasons and to the festivals that Elohim outlined in the Torah and Tanakh. Okay, can we think of the special days and months and years that the Apostle Shaul would be talking about? How about Hanukkah? How about Purim? How about Tu B'Shavat? How about Lag BaOmer? How about some of these other holidays maybe that are not contained in the scriptures if you do your research and your homework? How about Tisha B'Av? Just fasting in general over the temple's destruction. Where does Elohim say to do this? And there are plenty of people out there like this dispensationalist who are searching for truth. They've been taught lies in the church. They've been taught lies in the synagogue, i.e. Semicha. Oh, there's a big chain of rabbis that go back to Moshe or Moses. Oh, there's a big chain of apostles that go all the way back to Kepha or Peter. Okay, brothers, if this is true, how come all these church fathers and apostles didn't teach what the apostles of the first century taught? Okay, brothers, if this is true, how come all the rabbis aren't teaching what Moshe taught? Can we think on that for a moment? And I wanted to make mention of brothers and sisters in the faith teaching that Enoch is scripture. No, and I'm not criticizing you or judging you. I'm just letting you know that Enoch promotes sun worship because it promotes the incorrect calendar, and Enoch worship because it claims that he is the Messiah. When Matityahu, or Matthew chapter 23 and verse 35, Yeshua, who is a manifestation of Elohim, and not everybody in the Messianic movement understands this, says, "And so upon you will come all the righteous blood," and he's responding to the Pharisees, that has been shed on earth. He's basically indicting them and saying, your Pharisaical spirit has resulted in the shedding of righteous blood, particularly on the part of the prophets. He says, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. He was stoned to death. He said, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So Yeshua, right in that verse, is giving us a Jewish canon, which goes from the book of Genesis all the way to 2nd Chronicles. And people say, well, what about Malachi? Well, Malachi was written after 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It was written after Zechariah. That does not change the fact that when the books were canonized, they ended in 2nd Chronicles, where the death of Zechariah is described. And so, given that fact, Yeshua would not have been acknowledging Enoch as something that is inspired. There are also a lot of people in this movement claiming that Yeshua was a Pharisee, which doesn't even make any sense, by the way. Because if Yeshua was a Pharisee, and you think of how many times he taught against the doctrine of the Pharisees and the scribes, well, that would be like saying John is a Roman Catholic, but believes in keeping the biblical Sabbath and the feast days. It doesn't even click. Now, I know on this channel, I've made mention of this idea of burning the Talmud. And I know it's a traumatizing idea, particularly because in 1212, following the disputation of Paris, approximately 10,000 volumes of Jewish religious manuscripts, including Talmuds, were burned, and typically Jews were burned along with them. Now, in the context of people teaching against Yahweh the King, against Scripture, in that context, anything that contradicts or goes against what Elohim says to do should be discarded. But when it comes to sensitivities, I understand that maybe things need to be a little bit less inflammatory, but that point needs to be driven home, that in the context of people trying to say that their doctrine is greater than anything Elohim says, it needs to be addressed. Now, on the day that Yahweh the King comes, there will be no compulsory debates between Jews and Christians like there were at that time over sound doctrine. But what there will be is Yahweh going King Louis IX on everyone, because he's not going to tolerate anybody committing acts of treason or insurrection. It's either do as he says or likewise perish. You know, I saw a video from a Jew where he said, did you know that Maimonides' existence was predicted in the Torah? Because he read some sort of divine code into I forget what book. And I'd have been like, yes, sir, I know. Maimonides' existence was proven in Tanakh. Absolutely. Yes, I agree with you. Not in the way that you're explaining it. However, when Elohim counseled Solomon to write the Proverbs through his spirit, Shlomo said, do not add to his words, or Elohim, he will rebuke you and prove you a liar. So yes, Elohim knew that figures like Maimonides would come along and abrogate and interpolate and thus prove themselves to be liars, regardless of how many wise things they've said in their texts. Going back to the Christian side real quick, I had to ask the gentleman, why would the apostle Yaakov or James contradict his own decree for Gentiles to obey the Torah in Acts 15 in his own epistles? That just wouldn't even make sense. And upon being able to answer his questions with a lot of evidence, he said something to the tune of, wow, you've made me very curious, and I would like to research more. And he's even going to read letters by Epiphanius of Salamis, where he was refuting first century believers for doing the things of Torah, so that maybe he can see for himself that the people who first believed in Yeshua still did the commandments of the Bible or the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, whatever you want to call it.